Hello, I'm getting ready to complete the reading that was started in our reading selection from yesterday, which I think I got through the first page on food and recipes of the Westward expansion. So I'm going to continue on with the second part of that reading so that you can hear the rest of that book. I believe we got to the part that's called Pioneer Food. The pioneers were the first settlers to travel west. The journey from Missouri to California took between 4 and 6 months to finish. Edward's family traveled in a covered wagon that was pulled by horses. Edward's mother packed enough food to last for the whole trip. That's a lot of food. Some families that they met along the way could only afford to bring flour, cornmeal, bacon, coffee, sugar, and salt. Edward's family brought those supplies as well as beans, rice, canned fruits and vegetables, molasses, and beef suet, which is something that's got like chips of beef in it and some hard, cold beef fat in it. That doesn't sound very appetizing to me. Edward's family didn't have fresh meat until they reached the first buffalo herds in the Midwest. Then Edward's father hunted and killed a buffalo. His mother cooked some of the meat and dried the rest to save it for the trip. So that would be like jerky. Some people eat that dried beef jerky. Not me. Some pioneers also hunted deer, antelope, and birds. Others caught fish. And there's a painting of a buffalo hunter there. Cooking on the go. On their journey west, Edward's family usually stopped along the trail to rest for the night. Edward's mother cooked dinner over an open fire every night. The only cooking tools she brought with her were a heavy iron kettle, a frying pan, a small pot, and a wooden spoon. The rest of the wagon was filled with food, clothing, and farming tools. Some families that Edward's family met along the way had a tiny wood stove in their wagon. That way, the women could cook, bake, and even boil water while traveling. Edward's mother learned new ways of making food while traveling. The roads on the wagon trail were not paved. Edward's mother sometimes used the rocking of the wagon along the rough and bumpy roads to help her churn butter. Now, if you've never done this, this is kind of a cool little thing to do. If you take some heavy whipping cream that you can buy in the grocery store, and you put it in a glass jar, about maybe a cup, I guess, and you just shake it. Shake it, shake it, shake it. You can dance around and shake it and shake it, shake it. And if you watch it, what happens is that heavy cream, as it's being shaken, it'll start to get, a little more solid. And after all the liquid has been shaken into a solid form, you can open it up and throw a little bit of salt on it and spread it on your biscuits because you've just made butter. And it's really pretty good butter too, so you should try that. That was the whole purpose of her using the bumpy wagon to make the butter. All right, the next section is called Settlers and Prospectors. Once the pioneers reached a place they liked, they settled there. Edward's family settled in what is now the state of Oregon. Edward's father learned that the land in Oregon was good for growing wheat and raising cattle. The rivers there were full of a fish called salmon. Now remember, we don't spell salmon S-A-M-O-N. It's S-A-L-M-O-N. Edward's family raised cattle. They and many others sold the meat as well as milk, cheese, butter, and other foods to the growing number of people settling in California. Gold was discovered in California in 1848. Thousands of prospectors traveled to California in search of gold. Many of the people who moved there were more interested in searching for gold than in growing or raising food. They were happy to buy much of their meat and dairy products from the people of Oregon. Edward's Uncle Paul was a prospector. Edward learned from his Uncle Paul that prospectors lived a very different way than settlers did. Uncle Paul lived by himself in a tiny cabin in northern California. He had very few belongings, but he did own a frying pan and a kettle for heating water. He ate simple food that he called grub, G-R-U-B. Like most prospectors, Uncle Paul did not have much money. He wasn't married and he didn't like to cook. His meals were often made up of bread, canned beans, bacon, and strong coffee. As a treat, he sometimes ate canned sardines, which are little tiny fish. Uncle Paul hardly ever ate fruit, vegetables, milk, cheese, or eggs. When he had the money, he bought eggs and milk in a nearby town. He also caught and ate rabbits, squirrels, and fish. All right, this is called Prospector's Grub. Uncle Paul cooked his meals in simple ways. He cooked canned food right in the can on his stove or over a fire. He even ate the food right out of the can. Uncle Paul had a special way of making bread. He opened a bag of flour and poured in some water. He mixed the flour and water with his hands to make a dough. He took the dough out of the bag and pulled off small round pieces. And then he flattened the pieces and fried them in hot bacon grease. Edward loved to visit Uncle Paul. He liked looking for gold. He also liked eating out of a can and eating fried bread. This section is called mining camps, and this is actually a picture from a mining camp. You can see what it looks like there. When prospectors found an area that was full of gold, a mining company would build a camp nearby. The company would then hire people to mine the gold. Uncle Paul was never lucky enough to find much gold, but he lived near a mining camp. During one visit, Edward and his father rode into the camp to see what it was like. It was easy to get to the camp because the roads leading to it were flat and smooth. The miners worked hard and they ate a lot. The camp had a real kitchen and a dining house with 2 cooks. The cooks made soups, stews, roasted meats, and boiled potatoes and other vegetables. They also baked fresh breads, pies, and cakes every day. For breakfast, they made eggs, ham, bacon, toast, and hot porridge with canned milk. Porridge is, I guess, something sort of like oatmeal. Mining camps sometimes turned into small towns, complete with dining halls and general stores. This section is called the Cowboys' Chuck, C-H-U-C-K. The settlers and prospectors shared the West with cattle ranchers and cowboys. One year, Edward had a chance to visit his cousin Sam in Texas. Sam was a cowboy. He told Edward stories about driving cattle from the ranch to the market nearly 1,000 miles away. The cowboys called their food chuck. The very first cowboys carried their food with them in sacks that hung from their saddles. They usually brought bread, bacon, salt, and coffee with them. Many years later, cowboys traveled with a chuck wagon on these long drives. A cook drove the chuck wagon, which carried a large chest of food as well as fuel, water, pots, and pans. The cook traveled ahead of the cowboys and cattle. Each night he parked at the night's camp. He had dinner ready when the cowboys arrived. The cowboys worked hard and were hungry by dinner time after driving the cattle all day long. And here is a picture from a cattle drive with the chuck wagon and cowboys sitting around and eating. On most days, Sam and the cowboys ate steak for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Every few days, a cowboy killed a cow, and the cook would cut the meat into steaks. The cook used any leftover meat to make pot roasts or stews. When the meat was gone, a cowboy killed another cow. Along with steak, the cook usually served red beans, which the cowboys called prairie strawberries. He also served rice or potatoes, cornmeal mush, and biscuits or bread. Sam told Edward that sometimes the cook made a special treat, dried apple pie. The opening up of the West was an exciting time for the United States. New states such as Michigan, Oregon, California, and Texas joined the United States. Settlers found what they were looking for: land for farming and raising animals. There was also plenty of animals to hunt and fish and to catch. It seemed like there was enough food and land for everyone. However, as pioneers moved west, they settled on land that once belonged to different Native American tribes. Most of these tribes were forced by the U.S. government to live on small areas of land called reservations. It was a hard time for the Native Americans. The foods from these 4 groups of people, pioneers, prospectors, Native Americans, and cowboys, slowly blended together to create many different types of food and dishes of the West. So that concludes Food and Recipes of the Westward Expansion. I thought it kind of gave you a little different approach to just generally a textbook story that comes from this time period. I also wanted to read you this short little biography about the president that was mentioned in yesterday's letter, President James K. Polk, that Cordelia wrote in her letter. She wrote that she felt like this was what President Polk wanted them to do, was to explore into the West. He has a couple of things that he's famous for. He is the first president to institute the playing of Hail to the Chief as the accompaniment to a presidential entrance. And he also hosted the first Thanksgiving dinner at the White House. So he was born in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina in 1795, and he died in Nashville, Tennessee in 1849. So he was right there when the 49ers were going into California when he died. Polk gave us some of its most, gave the White House some of its most boring parties. No music, no dancing were allowed at the parties. Polk himself was very humorless, and he was always very suspicious of everybody. His wife Sarah was very, very religious, and she was also his private secretary and his chief consultant. They had no children. He worked very hard and slept very little. Polk virtually worked himself to death. He died at age 53, only 3 months after leaving the White House. He had the shortest retirement of any president. He did not trust banks. He kept all of his money in bags hidden around his house. He left everything to Sarah with the provision that their slaves be freed at her death. She lived for 42 more years, but she never left her home again except to go to church. So President Polk was had a few things that were interesting, but he basically was kind of a boring guy. That concludes reading section 2 for today. You will get reading video 3 tomorrow. Tomorrow. So thank you for your patience with the fact that I had to continue the video. So, bye.